two went on two walks with Lee on this one, both an hour and a half long, and then he's been out for about 2 hours with me, running, let's say, 30% of the time,
Ready for a
dropping,
snooze.
dropping the rest. He'd be knackered tonight, like
Knackered. Indeed, knackered.
he'd be clean clattered, mate. Two walks with Lee on this one, both an hour and a half long, and then he's been out for about 2 hours, running, let's say.
Okie doke, ready to go. Welcome all. 30 April 2025. Dis and Dat, the autonomouscollective.net. A little bit of yakking today, coming back to rentier capitalism. I've mentioned it before. I mentioned it partially in context when we were plowing through Michael Hudson's book, which is uh, an extension, as it were. Some would call it a meta sort of category, but it's not really a meta category. It's right there. It is there with the original concepts of rent. Um, it is much more pervasive, of course, and it has, as others will argue in terms of the code of capital, etc., that it has that kind of place. And in fact, it's quite significant. We could say it is the reason, and going all the way back with respect to, other kinds of recessions, depressions, etc., um, without going into a long thing on it, but that rentier capitalism really is at work in a significant number of cases. The trouble, of course, is that not a sufficient amount of, I mean, there is research. Some of it is quite dense and interesting, and I'm spending more time on that. Among other things, I should have something put together on this moderately soon, because it does, what we're going to look at today, does sort of imply a certain idea about the concept of categories. And that, of course, gets us into our math stuff. But it is about asset categories, which I had started way long time ago, but it now has a much greater sets of interest, and that is I can actually start talking about the problem of asset categories, and it fits into my little, you know, virtual capitalism model, and I think I can get all that to work a little bit with a toy model. We'll see. So I began with a small article. It's a comment almost, and it is about Brett Christopher's work, which I like a lot. Um, there are others who are working on it, but Brett has done recent work on this and has taken it to wherever it needs to go, and that is he's done one paper on applying it to the entire UK economy, which I think is that's exactly where Cockshot was going and or is going or can go, and the idea that you can actually use very large databases to actually work through the problem and see how it's quite conventional, and it's not burdened with labor stuff. Not that it's irrelevant. It's part of the whole problem. But I think it's important to look at this larger unpaid labor stuff, and it can be estimated. It can be quantified, and it's just that some people don't do it because yes, it's unpaid, it's less relevant, blah 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 blah. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and that's the kind of issue that I think where we are. So there's this article by Emra, and I think Emra, I don't know. There's no, I couldn't find a gender reference, but this is that pronoun problem. Uh, I think that Emra may be female. Karkillik, um, at Trent Nottingham, or was at Trent Nottingham, or done within the context of Trent Nottingham. And the article is Rentierism and the Commons, a critical contribution to Brett Christopher's Rentier Capitalism, and done in to me, a very important journal, Environment and Planning A, B, C, D, etc., Economy and Space. So rentierism and the commons, and the connection between rentierism and commons, of course, overlaps into a whole variety of other kinds of things that have to do with, sort of uh, uh, sort of the analysis of a variety of spatial arrangements of governance. And so, which relates to Elinor Ostrom's work, and the late Elinor Ostrom, but the first woman to get a Nobel Prize in economics. And yes, it took so damn long. And then, fortunately, a couple of more have gotten it. So that's all good things. And yes, it isn't really a Nobel, blah, blah, blah. In recent years, we've seen an increasing number of publications that offer the term of rentierism to define the current economic system in the global north. More recently, Brett Christophers has produced a series of work that aims to account for the ascendancy of rentierism from a political economy perspective, in which Marx is mostly neglected. This exchange article aims to bring Marx and Marxist thought back into the discussion to read rentierism politically. In particular, it inquiries into how rentierism relates to the nature of class relations by addressing an open secret, namely that rentierism rests essentially on the enclosure and expropriation of the commons. It analyzes rentierism as capital's counter-movement, enforcing its priorities and drives on spaces where alternative social systems emerge and develop. In the final part, a provocative conclusive remark is offered on Christopher's What Is to Be Done. And so you can see that it can relate to a variety of things. Autonomous Marxism, clearly a remaining issue in the post-war Marxist context. Rentierization, rentierism, rentier capitalism, and the commons. Introduction. In recent years, we've seen an increasing number of publications that offer the term of rentierism to characterize the current transformation of capitalism in the global north. And this includes Mazzucato, Piketty, Sayer, some people with whom you're probably pretty familiar. One of the key arguments traversing these accounts is that since the late 1970s, there has been a major shift toward a system of economic production and reproduction in which income generation has increasingly come to be a matter of possessing and controlling valuable assets that are scarce or artificially made scarce. This corresponds to a mode of economic organization in which money making rests increasingly on having rather than doing, or extracting value rather than creating it. More recently, Brett Christophers has offered a political economic critique of rentierism as a contribution to the cited literature, which, according to the author, has approached the phenomenon either ideologically, that's Ashkenazi and the recent work of Piketty, capital and inequality, etc., or in the tradition of moral economy, which is Mazzucato, Sayer, and Standing. In this empirically grounded and elegantly articulated political economic critique, nevertheless, Marx is largely neglected. Christophers argues Marx's rent was essentially everyone else's, that is, Ricardo's, Smith's rent. Adam Smith, David Ricardo. In Marx, rent was a pre-capitalist category, that is, a marginal, residual, or ephemeral phenomenon within capitalism. This view leads Christophers to offer an early conclusion that the reality of the early 21st century, i.e. rentierism, clearly belies Marx. Now, this argument is disputable, and, you can see that there are important folks like David Harvey and Antonio Negri are weigh in on this. The aim of this short exchange article, this is a short exchange article, but nicely, referenced so that we can start looking at other matters, which I've included below, which includes David Harvey talking about the dispossessed and, Aguirre and a bunch of other folks. So these are interesting arguments that lend them to be applied to a variety of activities. The aim of this short exchange article, nevertheless, is not to discuss to what extent the transformation of industrialism into rentierism was latently present in Marxist writing, or, to summarize how Marxist scholars early foresaw and theorized the return of rentierism precisely through Marx. Instead, it aims to bring Marx and autonomous Marxist thought back into discussion to read rentierism politically. That is, a strategic reading of rentierism from the perspective of class relations. And we can see, I guess this is Harry Cleaver. Indeed, Christopher's analysis of rentier capitalism is largely confined to the realm of economics and its reified categories. Herein, the concept of capitalism seems to designate not the social relations between classes, but rather a set of economic actors, mostly corporations, and economic parameters. This is where the quantitative work can happen, such as asset prices, investment volumes, productivity, growth rates, all circulating as mindless entities through the ups and downs of capital circuits. Mindless entities. This is useful. In brief, Christophers does not engage with the question of how rentierism relates to the nature of the class relations. This exchange article aims to address this question. In the first part of the article, I will briefly summarize Christopher's account. Now, there is a new Christopher's book out since this article, and so therefore other things have been addressed, and probably have to get back to that once I plow complete reading Christopher's. Christopher's account of Rentier Capitalism to make first-time readers acquainted with his ideas, as well as to contextualize my contribution, hence why I'm doing this. The contribution is based on an open secret, namely that rentierism rests essentially on the enclosure and expropriation of the commons. In the second part, I will discuss the political meaning, as understood above, of this truism through Marx and autonomous Marxist thought. In particular, I will analyze rentierism as a political project, that is, capital's counter-movement that enforces separation on spaces where communities organize on the terrain of commons, experiment with the processes of commoning, and develop alternative ways of social reproduction that are increasingly outside the circuits of capital. So there are a lot of stuff that implies, which are not necessarily covered in this little article. Rentier capitalism, defining rent as income derived from the ownership, possession, or control of scarce assets and under conditions of limited or no competition, and rentiers as those whose income primarily comes from the control of these assets, yes, those parasites. Christophers identifies rentier capitalism as Western countries' contemporary economic system that is substantially scaffolded by and organized around the assets that generate those rents and sustain those rentiers. We have some qualifiers here. Firstly, Christophers recognizes that only a few rent-bearing assets, if any, generate income automatically. That is, rent income requires control of an asset under conditions of limited or no competition, as well as some work for the delivery of the product or service underwritten it. So there's monopoly rents at work. Given the broad definition of rent, secondly, Christophers acknowledges that most economic production involves rentier elements. No, there's just all these contracts and agreements and shit. What is particular about rentier capitalism in connection to the first point is that of scale. It entails rent-bearing assets being not just leveraged in production, but substantively so. Indeed, he shows that the leading corporations in the UK are largely rentiers, service economy post-Thatcher. And the biggest sectors of the economy are largely characterized by rentier dynamics. He remarkably puts that rent is their shared raison d'etre. And rentierism is embedded in their individual and collective DNA. Well, thirdly, Christophers underlies that rentierism is not a novel phenomenon. We're now witnessing the return and ascendancy of it. He agrees with Arrighi and Piketty in that rentierization of the economy has been a cyclical phenomenon over the longue durée. Longue durée is a reference to Annales history. It's the idea that we look at very long swings through history, punctuating international capitalist development on a recurring basis. The return of rentierism, according to Christophers, has taken place over the course of the last 4 decades under neoliberal economic policies. How? He offers four key respects in which neoliberalism has had beneficial consequences for rentierism. Number one, a growing pool of valuable assets has been made available for capital owners through privatization, financial deregulation, and so forth. Number two, and we're in this current period of financial deregulation and privatization, note. Number two, policies such as the neutralization of competition have been activated, enabling asset owners to further exploit their assets commercially. Number three, rentier-friendly monetary and fiscal policies such as tax subsidies, see tariffs, have been created. And number four, asset prices have been artificially accelerated to promote rentierism and make rentiers more wealthy. Yeah. For Christophers, the return of rentierism has had several adverse consequences for the UK economy. His starting point is what he calls the essence of rentierism, namely monopoly power in the control and exploitation of rent-bearing assets, inimical to economic dynamism, innovation, and the development of production. By analyzing the UK data, Christopher shows how the lack of motivation to innovate and advance the production process has gone hand in hand with the plunge of capital investment and labor productivity since the 1970s. The inevitable result has been declining growth in economic output, that is, a slowdown in the overall economy. The latter has then culminated in a major resorting of incomes in a way that the pain has been shouldered by workers, while capital has begun to enjoy a greater share of national income. In parallel, finally, wealth inequality has increased dramatically, a typical result of rentierism as discussed by Piketty. Rentierism and the Commons. In this part, my objective is to read rentierism politically. It is based on an understanding of the concept of capital as a social relationship in which opposing forces confront each other. In this antagonistic relationship, capital acts as a force that is committed to a continuous expansion. Accumulate, accumulate. That is Moses and the prophets, as Marx says. This commitment concerns not only growth in monetary terms, but also the continuous accumulation of capital relation. That is, the capitalist process of production produces not only commodities, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capital relation itself. On the one hand, the capitalist, on the other hand, the wage laborer. What capital desires, in other words, is to create life worlds in its own image or to colonize existing ones, see crypto, since the beginning of its history until it has colonized all of life. Nevertheless, capital exists with other forces that act as a limit on its sole drive to valorize itself. Marx identifies the major opposing social force as living labor as subjective being. The latter expresses an absolute interest, that is, emancipation from capital, which cannot be mediated. This interest manifests itself in political actions such as strikes, refusal of work, sabotage, slowdown, absenteeism, and so on. But it also manifests itself in more radical forms, which include not only resistance, but also reversal, such as the invention of alternative socioeconomic systems that provide various degrees of protection from the relations of capitalism. Confronted with this, capital creates and implements counter strategies because it cannot abide limits. This is very Harvey. Capital is the endless and limitless drive to go beyond its limiting barrier. Every limit appears as a barrier to overcome. So this is an important notion about limits and barriers, and of course, Marx and calculus ultimately. And defining rentierism as a socioeconomic system in which incomes are substantially generated by rents, Christophers also provides an overview of the core asset types that are at the center of the system. He identifies these assets as land, natural resources such as water that also yield natural monopoly rents, intellectual property, electromagnetic spectrum, user-generated data on digital platforms, and financial assets that often manifest themselves as the tradable form of the rent-bearing assets, e.g. commodity markets. What is notable here, in my opinion, is that all these assets that generate rents and sustain rentierism can be fairly understood as the commons. And I'll stop here for the second to note, is this a piece of totalizing discourse, et cetera, et cetera? That's sort of an interesting question left for another time. So back. If rentierism designates a system of economic production and reproduction that dominantly characterizes today's capitalism in the global north, this system is based essentially on the enclosure and expropriation of the commons. In the literature, the commons refer typically to a resource pool that contains all the creations of nature that we inherit jointly and freely and hold in trust for future generations. The air, water, rivers, land, forests, fruits of the soil, fisheries, electromagnetic spectrum, and so forth are the commonwealth of the material world. Yet, there is extensive Marxist literature that conceptualizes the commons beyond the fruits of nature. Here, the commons are also understood as human-made resources. For example, creative, cultural, social commons, whose creation is based on the accumulated general intellect. Remember, we were talking about months ago about the general intellect in capital. And affect of humankind, and in many cases are produced through the channels of social cooperation beyond the capital relation. And this includes a whole bunch of folks, Hart and Negri, Fuchs, a lot of the big names in this discourse. Indeed, according to Marx, products such as knowledges, languages, information, affects, ideas, and so forth are the creations of universal and communal labor, thought about partly by the cooperation of men now living, but partly also by building on earlier work. In this broader view, the commons are understood both as a noun and a verb. They refer not only to nature's gift and human-made communal resources, but also to the processes of production whereby these resources are allocated, used, and reproduced in a way that increasingly escapes the capital relation, i.e. commoning. And now this is not a recent problem. This is an issue that goes back to, putting in fences in the 19th century in the American West, goes back to in the enclosure movement in the feudal, in the medieval times, etc. In his seminal article, The Tragedy of the Commons, Garrett Hardin conceptualizes the commons as resources for which there is free and unmanaged access. He argues that this unregulated access would inevitably accumulate in resource depletion and environmental degradation because humans are naturally competitive economic creatures, homo economicus, that would try to maximize their revenue and thereby not take care of these common resources as there is no incentive to do so and eventually plunder them. This very libertarian viewpoint is very problematic because Hardin's view became very popular, very Western in that particular context, Western United States, and problematic for pretty much obvious reasons. The policy implications of, well, they weren't so obvious. I mean, this is from where the wise use doctrine comes or doctrines come from and blah, blah, blah. The policy implications of this approach are clear. The most rational way to sustain the commons is either through private or state-led governance. Viewed as the intellectual rehabilitation of the commons, DeAngelis and Harvey and the works of Ostrom, elegantly show that Hardin's tragedy is far from inevitable, that's the problem of the Hardin viewpoint. Ostrom finds that the commons involve communities that negotiate the modalities of access to these resources. This is a whole, this can be defined as Ellickson does with a sort of game theoretic discourse. These communities engage in a form of self-management, this is a social control argument, that effectively arranges the collective allocation of common resources and users' responsibilities. This organization enables the sustainability of the commons and the related communities for centuries. And in effect, this affects liberal democracy as well. In a nutshell, Ostrom's work are essential to recognize that many communities can organize in the common to manage the allocation of common resources and responsibilities between users. However, some scholars argue that despite its strength, Ostrom's analysis does not go far enough. And this is a pretty big literature, and just in addressing that, on the one hand, it's posed as a quantifiable and model building problem, but it also raises other kinds of political questions. In Ostrom's cases, What comes after the allocation of common resources is private ownership. For example, one can sell the allocated resource to make money. DeAngelis, Fournier, Bullier, and Helfrich show that for many communities, the process of commoning includes not only organizing in the common, that is, the democratic and sustainable allocation of resources, but also organizing for and of the common, that is, the collective and democratic use and reproduction of the commons, respectively. You might call this in the Foucault context governmentality. In these communities, in other words, the process of commoning does not stop once the resources and responsibilities are communally allocated. It also defines the modes of use and reproduction of these resources through democratic and horizontal forms of governance. Gee, what a concept. In this framework, I think we can better understand the political meaning of rentierism, characterized by the enclosure and expropriation of the commons. Marx writes that what creates the capital relation, capital dash relation, can be nothing other than the process which divorces the worker from the ownership of the conditions of his own labor. Indeed, for Marx, the divorce of labor from her needs of subsistence forms the concept of capital. He is extremely precise on this. The capital relations presupposes a complete separation between the workers and the ownership of the conditions for the realization of their labor. This relation, according to Marx, evolves in such a way that it, that is capital, maintains and reproduces this separation on a constantly increasing scale until the historical reversal takes place. The historical reversal Marx mentions here suggests an association between direct producers and the means of production, or more generally, workers' access to, use, and reproduce, and more generally, workers' access to, use, and reproduction of social wealth in a mode of organization that is not strictly mediated by the natural laws of capitalism. And we know how that goes. The commons resisting enclosures and the practices of commoning that emerge around these commons are threats to the ordinary run of things. They present themselves as a limit on the very premise of capitalist social relations, that is, separation. The communities that produce and reproduce through the practices of commoning are not utopias. They are real antagonistic movements. See the Bundys. Showing that there can be a sustainable life beyond capital and state around the commons. In this regard, rentierism does indeed concern the enclosure of the commons through the mechanisms of, as Harvey calls them, accumulation by dispossession. That is, the transfer of common assets to the upper classes as a response to inner contradictions of capital accumulation, especially when surpluses of capital lie idle with no profitable industrial production outlets in sight. See Bill Gates. However, given that every economic category is simultaneously political, rentierism should also be read as capital's political counter-movement, enforcing separation on spaces where communities organized around the commons and experiment with practices of commoning towards inventing alternative social systems that are not determined by the priorities and drives of capital. And so there's a concluding remark, and that is on reclaiming the commons. Remember, I told you this is a short article. It could be a lot longer. In this article, I have argued that rentierism or rentier capitalism rests essentially on the enclosure and expropriation of the commons, which have an ambivalent relationship with capital. The commons are used as the basis for capitalist growth. However, the same commons also constitute the basis for alternative autopoietic social system that might overcome the hegemony of capital. God, fully automated luxury communism. Enclosures, in other words, define a strategic terrain among social forces. By enclosing the commons, capital attempts to fix or temporarily overcome its inner contradictions, as in rentierism. But by doing so, it simultaneously destroys the, quote, cell form of the social force that is responsible to establish and reproduce life, and by this, to abolish capital. In the final chapter of Rentier Capitalism, Christopher's, this is the 2020 book, there's a new book, 2022 or 23, whatever, discusses 4 key areas in which some actions should be taken to move beyond rentierism. while he acknowledges these areas as number one, competition policy, number two, tax system, number three, state led formation of a new economy, and four, ownership, he aptly puts the accent on the latter, for ownership, property, underpins all the others. Indeed, what, after all, is rentier capitalism if not a mode of economic production and reproduction in which the bulk of society's valuable economic assets are owned by capital? Christopher suggests that these assets should be retaken from rentiers. But when retaken, who will own them? He offers a mixed plural ecology of ownership in which, for example, some natural resources are given to the state, intellectual property stay in private hands, and others are transferred to some communities. Yet, he does not explain why, for example, intellectual property stay in private hands. I shall conclude in a more provocative way. As various social movements across the world have been expressing for decades, neither markets nor states have been able to provide social justice, sustainability, and happy lives for all. Now, while states cannot be abstracted from capital, e.g., the state finance nexus, capital in turn reproduces socioeconomic injustices, asymmetrical power relations, environmental catastrophes, and depressed lives. The commons belong to their real owners, namely the commoners, who can, under particular conditions, define for themselves alternative social systems that are not mediated by the capital or the state. What these conditions, as well as the limits and boundaries of commoning, might be, see social ontology, and how they can be addressed collectively might inform future research. De Angelis and Stavridis is a good place. Now, note that, the endnotes are good. Rentier Capitalism opens with an epigraph, which might be regarded as the most condensed form of Christopher's overall thesis. That is, the current transformation of capitalism is characterized by a full-fledged comeback and proliferation of forms of rent. Now, Carlo Versolone, who could not find any further place in Christopher's work, was not only one of the earliest scholars theorizing the return of renterism by offering the concept of the becoming rent of profit, but he was also the one who did that through Marx. With an extraordinary power of foresight, the development of the analysis of Volume 3 of Capital, yes, we're going to get there, together with the Grundrisse, helps us see the becoming rent of capital was inevitable. And note two, the merchants, the rentiers, as well as financiers are repositioned as the arbiters of capital accumulation relative to industrial capital. This is how the distribution of wealth and income became so distorted from the 1970s onward. If you look at, for example, the energy crisis, that becomes deflected into speculation on commodities futures, etc. Number three, industrial capitalism has given way increasingly to rentier capitalism, and the mechanisms by which rentier capitalism works are more and more about appropriation and accumulation by dispossession, David Harvey, than they are about the organization of production and the exploitation of living labor in production. Now, those things still exist, but this dispossessive idea is clearly there. The new imperialism offers many elements that explain the return of renterism from a Marxist perspective. Number four, at this level, capitalism supports itself on rent. The great industrialists, instead of reinvesting profits, recycle it in the mechanisms of rent. The circuit, the blood of capital, is now rent. Rent plays an essential role in the circulation of capital and the maintenance of the capitalist system. It maintains social hierarchies and the command of capital. Number five, Christopher's examines rentier capitalism in the UK. However, he recognizes that the UK experience is broadly representative of the wider system of Western rentier capitalism. Number six, footnote, endnote. Self-valorization in Marx means the expanded reproduction of every element of class relations. Number seven, our common knowledge is the foundation of all new production of knowledge. Linguistic community is the basis of all linguistic innovation. And our common social image bank makes possible the creation of new images. That's a whole other thing that we can get into, and that's where, you can take the leap into, well, as some of us, it's a semiotic problem, and which goes back to my earliest, musings about the political economy of science, among other things, and Baudrillard, blah, blah, blah. So there's good references here. And I picked one, which I'll close with because, we've been fiddling around with stuff. I'll just perhaps read the front end of the Brent Christopher's article, Economy in Space, the Rentierization of the United Kingdom Economy. This is the abstract. There's a growing groundswell of opinion in commentary on the political economy of the global north that the neoliberal era has seen the forceful reemergence of rentier capitalism. This article analyzes the case of the United Kingdom, the UK, identifying and delineating the predominant forms of contemporary rentierism operating in the UK and using a range of data sets pertaining to the shape of the national economy. It shows that rentierism, in its various guises, is today a significant, even dominant dynamic in contrast to during the period preceding the neoliberal turn. The article further seeks to account for the ascendancy of the rentier in the UK under neoliberalism, highlighting key developments in the realms of monetary and fiscal policy and policies related to asset ownership and property rights. The past decade or so has seen a growing consensus in political economic scholarship that the most significant structural transformation experienced by the UK economy during the post-1970s neoliberal period has been its financialization, whereby, to borrow the definition used by Greta Krippner in her analysis of the parallel financialization of the US economy, profits increasingly accrue through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. We see in the current, let me break here and say, in the current instance, people are making a heck of a lot of money through chaos in the trade and commodity production, but the financial channels are still rolling along. As far back as 2008, Ewald Engelen described the US and UK economies as those which arguably have moved furthest in the direction of being truly financialized. More recently, Davis and Walsh noted that the UK economy has become more financialized and has gone through a more pronounced process of de-industrialization than any of its major economic rivals. Such declarations are no longer seriously questioned. That the UK's is a financialized economy is now more or less a stylized fact, a commonplace of current scholarship on its structural disposition. That finance has become a more significant sector of the UK economy is indisputable, but this does not necessarily mean that financialization is the most useful or accurate descriptor of the economy's overall metamorphosis. For one thing, other sectors have also become more significant. Indeed, the share of the real estate sector in national economic output, measured in terms of gross value added, GVA, increased by more than that of finance, both between 1992 and 2004 and between 2005 and 2014. Furthermore, in absolute terms, finance in the UK is nothing like as dominantly economically as finance in the financialized USA. In the latter, the finance and insurance sector's share of corporate profits, see health system, hit nearly 40% at its peak in 2002 and has been consistently above 25% during the last 2 decades. In the UK, for which corporate profits shares are not available, the finance and insurance sector's share of gross operating surplus, the national account's best proxy for profits, have never exceeded 15%, and its share of GVA has never exceeded 10%. To be sure, financialization, as documented in political economic scholarship, has never been only about an expanding finance sector. It also entails non-financial companies earning increasing amounts of income from financial sources, interest, dividends, etc. See car companies. Nevertheless, for the UK case at least, the concept fails, as we will see, to capture the wider structural changes that have been taking place, changes to which financialization is certainly central, see Tesla, and of which it represents one especially notable example, but of which it is not, and is not anywhere close to being the totality. The UK economy, the article suggests, has not been financialized, or not only that, it has more generally been rentierized. Since the beginning of the 1980s, there's been a broad-based shift towards economic activities conducted by rentiers, in the sense that they are structured around the control of and generation of income, that is, rents, from scarce assets. The latter assuredly include financial assets, the expanded creation and circulation of which has been integral to financialization. Thus, following Michael Hudson and Bessemer, I treat the financial sector as perhaps the leading rentier sector, and financialization as or the leading edge of rentierization. Key UK rentier asset portfolios today also include property assets, see Kensington or South Kensington, which is to say land and its appurtenances, the expanding commoditization and monetization of which has been integral to the above-mentioned growth in the real estate sector. But the rentierization of the UK economy has entailed the disproportionate growth of rents derived from assets extending far beyond finance and property alone. Defining rent as income derived from the ownership, possession, or control of scarce resources and under conditions of limited or no competition, the article's first aim, pursued alongside definition in the first main section and in conversation with existing literature on rentierism, is to identify the full range of the latter's main contemporary UK-based variants that could have been broken up. There are several different substantive categories of rentier, controlling different kinds of assets and realizing different forms of rent. Recognizing this diversity is essential to an understanding of the rentier economy. Broad generalizations do not suffice. They are quite simply, defied by the complex, variegated reality. Factors such as the nature of the underlying asset and the nature of prevailing arrangements for its ownership and control indelibly shape how and by whom the asset is commercially exploited to realize rental payments. The article identifies 8 core asset types and offers a summary analysis of the form of the particular rentier economy arrayed around each one. If financial and land rents are especially notable, it is less for their scale than for the fact that these are the only forms of rentierism in which UK households are active rentier participants, namely as significant owners, highly unevenly, of course, of financial and residential property. Yes. In all other rentier subsectors, by contrast, rentierism is a strictly corporate affair. The second section of the article considers the question of scale. How economically significant in the UK today is rentierism, and how has its degree of significance changed in recent decades? The discussion begins with a consideration of the methods of measurement of rentier incomes and income shares found in the existing literature. These methods, I show, are inappropriate to the case at hand, principally insofar as they construe rentiers and rents either fundamentally different or considerably more narrowly than they are specified in this article. Those scholars who use a similar definition of rent to the one used here, meanwhile, have not attempted to measure the scale of rentier incomes in the UK or anywhere else. For reasons elucidated, it is not possible to measure the significance of rents as defined here to the UK economy with anything like exactitude, but using a range of data sets and examining them in relation to the different forms of rentierism identified in the first section of the article, it is nevertheless possible to assess degrees of significance in a sufficiently meaningful way to enable conclusions about the relative importance of rent and rentiers to be reliably drawn. The analysis shows that the UK economy is indeed now rent-dominated, according to any reasonable interpretation of dominance. Its leading corporations are largely rentiers, and the biggest sectors of the economy are largely characterized by rentier dynamics. More importantly still, the significance of rentierism has grown markedly since the 1970s. That is to say, the economy has been substantially rentierized. This is not the first time in the history of UK capitalism that rentier interests have been ascendant. Just as Giovanni Arrighi argued that on an international scale, financialization has been a cyclical phenomenon over the longue durée, one occurring episodically as national economic hegemons wax and wane. So Thomas Piketty has argued that rentierization, which clearly exists in a mutually constitutive, highly complex relation with financialization, has also punctuated international capitalist development on a recurring basis. Rentierism was the predominant feature of Western economies in the late 19th century Gilded Age. That period of what Piketty calls patrimonial capitalism, that's the White House, in which overall income profiles were dominated by rents on various forms of inherited assets, lasted until around the First World War, from which point the significance of rentier incomes gradually receded. Only from around the 1970s, Piketty suggests, did rentierism reemerge as a leading feature of Western economies, the UK's included. Piketty's historical narrative is important for emphasizing a key point, and one which Doreen Massey and Michael Rustin in the Kilburn Manifesto have made for the UK more particularly. That is, rent and rentierism have deep historical roots, especially in the UK case, in the shape of powerful financial and landed property interests. Yes, landed property. Both of these sets of interests, Massey and Rustin noted, seek to profit primarily from the holding of assets rather than production and human labor. See the Royals. Both are renterist and both are utterly embedded in the British class structure. Indeed, Rustin and Massey went so far as to assert that historically rent has been more important in the mentality and practice of Britain's ruling class than industrial production. In this sense, post-1970s renterization in the UK is more about the return of the rentier, albeit in a much more diverse guise, see Saudi Arabia, than in an unprecedented rise to dominance. The third and final section of the article seeks to account for this return. Piketty may be right to say that rentierism is capitalism's logical destination, with capital always tending to transform itself into rents as it accumulates in enough amounts. But if so, it is clear that in the UK, in recent decades, capitalism has been hurried and helped towards its terminus by a series of exceptionally rentier-friendly political interventions. In large measure, these interventions collectively represent what we have come to understand as neoliberalism. As Jose Palma has observed, neoliberalism at the international scale has served to facilitate the ever-increasing rent-seeking practices of oligopolistic capital, in effectively reducing pressures on big agents to engage in competitive struggles in the real economy while doing the opposite to workers and small firms. It has helped transform capitalism into a rentier's delight. Well, he does not use the N word. The Financial Times columnist Jonathan Ford has made much the same point about the UK more specifically, noting how successive post-1970s governments have long since converted the country and its economic terrain into a rentier's paradise. I endeavor This is Christopher's. I endeavor to identify the key mechanisms of such conversion. 4 decades of neoliberal approaches in the pivotal realms of monetary and fiscal policy and policies related to asset ownership and property rights, I argue, have created highly favorable conditions both for the production and maintenance of scarce commercial resources and for those in possession of such assets to extract rents securely from them. The Thatcher Revolution and everything that has happened since has, in this respect, been an exercise in subdividing the economy into a series of sinecures upon which large firms stake their claims, protected from competition by watertight rights over scarce resources. UK neoliberalism, in short, has given rentierism its head. Economic rent is a difficult concept to come to grips with because it means many different things to different people, and et cetera, et cetera. That's a whole nother section. It's a very long article, actually. Well, I mean, 20 some odd pages. So there's a lot more, and there's graphs and tables and all kinds of other funny stuff in that particular article, among others, which I've added here, which we may do a little bit tomorrow, depending on my energy. But I've at least introduced the concept. So I give you an introductory article by someone at Nottingham Trent on rentierism and the commons being an interesting way to describe kind of the agglomeration or describing the totality of the project. It also opens up other issues that overlap into other kinds of ways of thinking about both tangible and intangible assets. And I think this is, for me, useful, interesting. It gives me a way of talking about the kind of virtuality of capital that is has been already constructed, is continuing to be constructed, and I think it's a vital research area. So that's my little set of comments. Let's see what the chat has to say. Nobody has anything to say, so I'm going to stop the share and remove us from the live stream. Thank you very much. This is the autonomouscollective.net, 30th of April, 2025, and we've been talking a little bit about Rentier Capitalism.